Today is a day like any other day. Today is business as usual. Today is normal. Until it's not. Then it's a day when seconds make all the difference. When communications and coordinations must be clear and quick. When keeping people from harm, maintaining continuity, and protecting assets hangs in the balance. When shaving seconds could keep employees safer in a natural disaster. Or tens of thousands could be saved every minute by keeping businesses up and running. When more lives are protected when facing an active shooter. When trauma victims can be reached and treated faster. And first responders can organize evacuations better. The Everbridge Critical Event Management Platform delivers organizational resilience on an unprecedented scale, combining real-time monitoring, situational awareness, and integrated response across the enterprise for a common operating view. We hope a day like this never comes. And yet it's a day we prepare for every day at Everbridge. Keeping people safe, assets protected, and businesses running. Returning to normal on a day that turns out to be anything but.
Hello and welcome to Economist Impact's panel session on next generation continuity, creating a culture of sustainability and business resilience. My name is Matthew Oxenford and I'm the senior analyst for Europe and lead analyst for climate change policy at the Economist Intelligence Unit, Economist Impact's sister organization. I'll be moderating today's proceedings, and I'd like to thank Everbridge for sponsoring today's event and making it all possible, and for all of you as well for tuning in. Just to outline sort of some of the issues that we want to discuss in the session today, innovation in information technology has been driven in part by changing demands from the market, from consumers across the piece. There's now really been more of a shift from urgent resilience plans made in the last several years to more intentional strategies that are meant to address whatever the next major business disruption might be. But one crisis that clearly is going to need urgent attention is going to be the climate crisis and its impact on businesses. As we quickly approach the 2030 deadline for emissions reduction targets across the world, it's important that we understand the role that sustainability plays in business resilience and also in corporate continuity. With that in mind, and with the greater technology that we're discussing, comes a greater burden on the energy systems of the world. And now that cloud computing technologies have matured, there's really an opportunity to re-examine their impact on the environment. Storing these massive amounts of data reliably comes with a significant energy cost, along with the need for massive amounts of space. Weighing the need for this advanced technology against the responsibility to act sustainably will be at the heart of reducing the world's reliance on these non-renewable resources. While the pandemic in the last several years has pushed for more immediate, drastic change, natural disasters and extreme weather events are starting to exact a very similar pressure on companies to think and act more sustainably. Businesses in everything from financial services to retail are thinking about how to reduce their carbon footprint while also accounting for the increasingly extreme conditions that are beginning to snarl supply chains and operations. But making adjustments to the operations and processes that come with these challenges also come with the challenge of justifying the cost of such a significant strategic shift. So over the course of the next hour, we want to examine how companies can incorporate that sustainability mindset into their increasingly important continuity and resilience plans. To do that, I have an excellent panel of three experts. I'm joined by Tracy Reinhold, the Chief Security Officer at Everbridge, Ariel Kangasnami, Global Director of Sustainability at Manulife, and Graham Handy, the Managing Director at FDI Consulting. So just to sort of outline how we want to take the next 45 to 50 minutes, I first want to sort of go into a bit of discussion about the threats that I've just discussed and how they're informing resilience strategies, then looking at the sustainability element, and then sort of wrapping it up as looking at sustainability specifically from the lens of value for a business. So just to start, I guess the first question I would ask is looking at sort of starting in the past and then moving to the future. I want to talk about the pandemic as sort of a dry run for potential new focus on continuity plans. Have we seen a huge amount? Have we seen this pandemic serve as a stress test for continuity plans? And is that sort of a significant dry run for what we're seeing in the future? Tracy, is the Chief Security Officer, I think you're very well placed to talk about some of these issues. If you want to sort of just share some of your insights with the pandemic and what that might be, what that might foretell for future focuses on sustainability.
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate it. Ariel, Graham, thanks for joining us today. So I'm actually in New York today, and I hosted a CSO roundtable the other night that actually focused on the impacts of the pandemic and how organizations were able to pivot or not pivot during the last couple of years. What we've determined is that two things have become primary factors in that. The adoption of technology is obviously critically important for organizations to be resilient and to be able to pivot quickly to address emerging threats and vulnerabilities. I think what we've seen is there are companies that are no longer with us because they did not maintain a resilient posture. You know, for the last 30 years or so, we've always prioritized revenue over risk in the corporate world. Unfortunately, that's tended to come home to roost during the pandemic. And those organizations that were not able to pivot, not able to adopt a technology, not able to embrace a remote workforce, were unfortunately sidelined for the last 2 years. Understanding that there are certain industries that didn't have that option. I was talking with a major manufacturer yesterday, and he indicated that they had factory workers around the world housed in their facilities during the pandemic so that they could maintain production because it was critical not only for the company's sustainability and survival, but also the product that they produced was critically important for individuals around the globe. This is a company that was able to adjust to the new reality on the fly, which also involved not only the security team, but also human resources, finance, and the C-suite as well to ensure that the organization was able to have the flexibility necessary to address this crisis in a way that allowed them to sustain their viability as an organization and to provide the type of services that the world required from them during this 2-year period. I will say that we do need to be a little bit careful in that we do not focus myopically on yesterday's threat. And I think Matthew did a good job of articulating the specific climate change challenges that we're going to face going forward. And we need to be able to address the unexpected in order to maintain a resilient posture going forward.
Great, that's very interesting. Yep. That's very interesting. I think that some of the points that you raise, whether that's the adoption of technology, whether that's the pivot from maximizing efficiency to maximizing resilience, whether that's the sort of the need for agile processes from the management structure all the way on down, I think these are things that we're probably going to hear quite a bit for the duration of the discussion. Graham, as the managing director of a consultancy, I'm sure you've seen quite a lot of these. Do you think that this is generally sort of the right framework to be thinking about how the pandemic has affected things, and also how structures need to adapt going forward?
I think it's a really interesting question, and actually a lot of what Tracy has been saying really resonates. Look, I mean, we work very, very closely with the senior insurance risk officers around the globe across an industry, insurance, which by definition ought to be forward-looking and anticipate the almost unexpected. Pandemic's a classic example, actually, where if you looked at any business continuity plan for any major corporation, and in particular an insurance company, then pandemic would have featured somewhere on the risk register. But what was really interesting, I mean, we host regular roundtables with the risk functions of insurance companies, and the really interesting observation that comes through cuts right across your opening question, Matthew. Were business continuity plans, a good dry run for the pandemic? And the answers are yes and a no. In particular, pandemics created all sorts of potential capital and profitability events for insurers. But what many insurers hadn't anticipated was the operational burden, particularly of the lockdowns around the world. And if we had the pandemic 5-10 years earlier, without some of the technology capabilities that Tracy alluded to, I think we would have seen a far less resilient insurance response to the demands that were placed on that industry during the last 2 years. With the ability to work from home and to effectively place a lot of operations remotely, supported by some pretty snazzy technology, some of which we're using right now, we've been able to keep that industry going in a way that many other industries did falter. And I think it's worth keeping that as a sharp point in our thought process. We can do all the business continuity planning we like. We can think about redundancies and built-in controls and what ifs. But in the end, unless we actually do prepare and make bets on some pretty robust underlying infrastructure, then the next shock may not be the one that we actually prepare for. And that's something that's at the forefront of my clients' minds.
Absolutely. And I think sort of focusing on that question of technology, obviously there are very particular technologies such as you say, ICT technology, video conferencing, the cloud that were very important for this particular unexpected event. But as we sort of try and project from the past to the future, we might want to ask ourselves, what are the technologies and what are the processes that we should be looking at in a forward-looking perspective. So I want to bring Ariel in to talk about that particular issue. Do you think that the technologies and the processes that the pandemic really brought to the fore are going to prove themselves again in response to more of a climate-related disruption, or do you think that there's something new that we need to be focusing on?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, for Manulife, we've certainly maintained some of the good habits that actually happened through the COVID pandemic and the technology that enabled that. I just think about recently we had a group of our risk officers come in and have a discussion on ESG. And one thing that they were talking about was the benefit that not commuting and not business traveling has had on both our carbon footprint, but as well as costs. And the technologies enabled that. If we didn't have that technology in place, that wouldn't have happened. Going forward with respect to climate change and some of the events there, I think the technology that we certainly see as a real enabler is the technology that helps us to assess the level of risk. Manulife is not a typical insurer of physical assets, but we are an asset manager and we own vast amounts of forests, farms, and real estate, and those are all exposed to physical risks. And so the technologies that we're seeing come into play in those circumstances are things like GIS, really advanced GIS systems. We use things like LiDAR in our forests and farms to actually really get a good sense of inventories and their exposure to other physical assets that climate risk is going to come into play for. So it's a combination of that technology that enables your operations just to run smoothly, but also the technology from a climate risk perspective that is going to help you predict events in the future.
Now that makes a lot of sense. Just to sort of close out the question on technology, be interested in going back to Tracy and talking about more of a deep dive into what you see as sort of the key technologies, both looking backwards and, as you said, looking forwards. We've talked about monitoring technologies. We talked about ICT technologies. We talked about information storage and resilience technologies. Is there any sort of rule of thumb or idea of sort of what technologies we should be looking out for and we should be focusing on, not when we're looking backwards, but when we're looking forwards?
So, Matthew, what I would say is that one of the things that we have to consider is a risk and threat agnostic approach. We need to be very careful that we don't myopically focus on climate change. It is a huge issue, but there are other issues that also manifest. The one, I guess, ray of sunshine from the pandemic is that it did accelerate the acceptance of technology globally. Granted, it was because we had to accept it, but remember that the life cycle of technology is very short. So new technologies are constantly being developed and tested and utilized around the world. I think one of the things that we need to look at, both looking back and looking forward, is the ability to geolocate threats relative to our own assets. We need to be able to overlay threat to the proximity of the things that we care about. And the earlier that we know through intelligence aggregation and deconfliction, the better positioned we are to protect our people and our resources going forward. So by that, what I'm talking about is, if we use climate change as an example, there's been an acceleration of severe storms globally. The ability to manage that data and then to use the data in retrospective to say, what's the pattern that we're seeing developing from a global climate change environment, and how does that impact our ability to either sustain our operations in a specific area of the world, or how are we looking at expansion? We should be considering the impacts of climate change when we look at the acquisition of new properties or new locations globally. Being able to understand the pattern and the increased frequency allows us to make informed decisions for our organizations, so that it doesn't mean we shouldn't move somewhere. It means that we should move somewhere with the very best intelligence available so that we can make the right decisions and manage the risks as they manifest. So I think that we've just barely touched the edge of technology. If you think about, I'm old, so when I started in my professional career, there was no such thing as a cell phone. And now, can you imagine not surviving or surviving without a smartphone? Right? So all of this technology that we take for granted today is going to be antiquated very quickly with the life cycle of technology development. So part of it is keeping an open mind, adjusting to the new realities of the technology boom, and then leveraging that or harnessing that to protect our assets in a way that ensures sustainability and resilience going forward. Because, the old saying, what got us here is not going to get us there. The same is true for technology. And I think it would be irresponsible of me to say, this is going to be the next big technology thing, because I guarantee you I'll be wrong. But I think keeping an open mind and opening that aperture to the acceptance of technology is what's going to allow us to maintain a resilient posture going forward.
Absolutely. That makes quite a lot of sense, given the amount of uncertainty that we're talking about in the technological space, in the climate space, in the resilience space. So trying to sort of dig a little bit deeper into the particular way that a business might sort of focus on developing a new resilience plan. Given all this uncertainty, particularly around climate, what are the sort of best ways that a company can, and business leaders should look to try and incorporate the sustainability risks into their business plan? Ariel, I'm going to ask you, because I know that you've been engaged on this sustainability issue in depth. So what is a sustainable resilience plan, and what's the process that business leaders should take to get there look like in the context of all of this technological change that Tracy rightly points out is highly uncertain, even in responding to this?
Yeah, for sure. It's a difficult question to answer, because we still, from a sustainability lens, taking resilience completely out of the picture and just looking at sustainability and a strategy and the operations of a business, we don't have all the answers on the best way in which to do that. But I think, as with any other process, really it starts with understanding where you're at today, and understanding the exposure to the risks that exist in your specific sector, the portfolios that you manage if you're an asset manager, and for insurance, and uniquely for us as a health insurer, thinking about things that other people may not be thinking about yet. And maybe I'll use the example, because this is a unique program that we've started to look into, which is the overlap of climate change and human health. And I think resilience comes into play there, given the fact that we have people who are exposed to greater temperatures than ever, more severe weather events. They're disrupted on a daily basis by these events. And something that happened for us that we saw, it was in British Columbia. There was a significant number of events there with wildfires, and trying to figure out the resilience of even the life insurance system and the health insurance system as it comes into play there was a challenge. And so that really has raised the question for us. And I think we're still at the question space of, how do these things impact our business? Technology is, a component of that, but I think we're so early stage right now that it's an information gathering process.
Yeah, I think the information gathering has a lot to say for that. Graham, obviously, I think you will have dealt with a lot of this in your own line of work and with some of the organizations you work with. What do you think in terms of incorporating sustainability into a resilience plan going forward with all of these uncertainties that Tracy and Ariel have laid out?
Well, I think the information gathering point is key. I call it the pulse check. So there's a whole bunch of technology enablement on the operational side of our businesses, fine. But I think the other side of the coin is the ability we have now in principle to deeply analyze, to track whether it's the supply chain or the behaviors of our customers or our clients, to target customer segments more closely, because we have the ability to take that pulse. And I think this applies across the investment portfolio. So, you talked about the exposure to real estate investment, but it's equally true. You just take something like lifetime mortgages is something which around the world our long-term insurers are exposing themselves to. Picking over the commercial properties or the retail properties that are likely to have a significant value in 20, 30 years' time, with all of the uncertainty that's going around, not just climate, but geopolitical uncertainty. That requires a depth of analysis. And we're doing a lot of work, FTI is doing a lot of work with its clients around the world just to arm them with more analytics and pulse check tools. And I think the other thing I would just say to that, just to round that off, is going right back to sustainability and climate change, is the part of an engagement policy, whether it's through investments, responsible investments, or selective underwriting of clients. Part of engaging with clients to help them make the transition is about, again, being able to take their pulse and track whether actually they are on the engagement journey that they committed to, and then being able to wrap that back into the message that you play into your stakeholders, whether they're activist investor groups or customers that care whether you're a green organization or not. So taking a pulse, turning that into good monitoring information, turning that into a supportive narrative for how we, the insurer, are helping the world go on this transition journey, is the other side of the technology coin, I think.
Yeah, I think that if you look at climate change, we spent a lot of this discussion so far talking about the physical risk that comes with climate change itself, whereas there are a lot of sort of cultural, values-oriented, ESG-related transition risks around the use of energy, around the use of scarce resources, and that's going to create just as important, but no less difficult series of risks. Tracy, do you think that sort of the way that companies look at these more policy and transition-oriented risks have anything in common with the way that they look more at physical risk, or do you think that there's a different sort of set of circumstances and priorities that firms need to look at in addition to all of the physical risks that we've been discussing?
So I will say that one of the challenges is that politics is not only the purview of the public domain, it also exists in the corporate world. So part of that is sustainability, part of that forward-looking effort by an organization is to be able to gauge the pulse of the public or the customer, and then to develop strategies that resonate with them. Obviously, climate change and, we were at COP26 back in Scotland or Ireland. I can't remember which one it was now. Sorry, way too much travel. But we have another COP coming up in Cairo in the fall. And I think that one of the things that organizations need to be aware of is that the momentum with which climate change viability and or awareness is growing is exponentially faster than it's been in the last 20 years. It used to be that it was a fringe element that talked about climate change. It has now become very much mainstream. So organizations, when they put together their sustainability strategy, need to be thinking about what this means for them, for their customers, for their upstream and downstream dependencies, for their vendors, and for their consumers. If they don't do that, if they turn a blind eye to that, I think what will happen is that someone else will step into that void and assume the responsibilities that they are neglecting, which would obviously impact brand reputation and revenue for an organization. So it's not just the physical risk that's associated with it. It's a lot of brand and reputation that goes into it, whether or not they are a sustainable member of the global economy, whether they take the future of the earth seriously, or whether they are short-termly focused on revenue generation versus sustainability. I think all of those things come into play, and all of those things are better managed through the aggregation and deconfliction of intelligence from disparate sources that give a certain amount of veracity to the intelligence that you're going to use to inform your business decisions as they relate to sustainability, to resilience, and to the face that you put forward to the public. I think all of those things are going to matter as we continue to evolve as a society and as climate change gathers more and more momentum.
It makes a lot of sense. I know that a lot of the clients that we've been working with have definitely seen climate change move to the center of their priorities for the exact reasons that you discuss. So sort of looking at not just from the side of what's driving this change, but how companies can react. Ariel, do you want to talk about sort of some of the actions that you've seen that your organization or organizations you've been working with have been taking to really sort of respond to this groundswell in public and political support for more action in reducing the carbon footprint of a business?
Yeah, for sure. So we had, some very significant commitments that we came out with just over a year ago now related to our climate action plan. And all those commitments were linked to three different pillars of our business, including our operations, our investments, and our products. And those were kind of the three areas that we needed to play in and are very central to our ability to act in this space. With respect to our operations, the activities that we're doing there are the ones that most people kind of typically think about, which is reducing our emissions, committing to things like net zero. I don't think there's too much to talk about there because I think most people are pretty familiar with the fact that companies are working to reduce their carbon footprints. And, technology is going to enable that, but even improvements to processes, innovation in our processes and the way that we do things will kind of push the bar there. The place where I think there's been the most innovation and focus recently is on our investments, because we're trying to think about how not only does climate risk impact our own business, but how does climate risk impact the businesses that we invest in? And in addition, how do ESG risks more broadly impact those businesses? So I was on an interesting call yesterday, actually, where this kind of came to a head is, our portfolio managers are slowly kind of from a general account perspective, which is the group that keeps our capital requirements in the spaces that they need to be to pay out our liabilities. Those portfolio managers have been getting up to speed on asking questions around ESG risk when we engage with our clients and when we engage with our investee companies. And a company that we were talking to was a chemical company based out of Germany, and they had a very, very ambitious plan around climate change and climate action. And a really good question that came from our portfolio manager was around, whether this emphasis on climate action and some of the work that was happening there was actually creating some new transition-related risks. So they wanted to use new feedstocks, and there was a smaller number of suppliers that could offer those feedstocks. So in the event that they don't have access to those suppliers, or other chemical companies are trying to move in to secure the same type of next-generation feedstock, how is a company managing those risks? So there's a lot of upside, but there's also the downside, and I think sometimes those conversations focus solely on what climate action is about in terms of pushing the bar forward on the climate commitments that we make, but it's also about managing the exposure to risks that we have on the financial capital side. So I think the investment space is really interesting. And then finally, on our products side of the business, it's thinking about offering ESG products to the people that we manage funds for. There is even more risk now with regards to regulations in those areas, because I think it's been a bit of a wild west on the ESG fund side. So we're certainly seeing things like EU taxonomy regulations come in that are going to help kind of tighten those things up. But it's also on the product side where we're offering things like, mobility programs for people who have been, sitting at their desks for the last two years. And, it's not just, a one size fits all, as I said. It's really integrating it into the core competencies of our business.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a massive variation, and the dynamics very different across the entire global insurance and asset management industry. And I guess I characterize it as, it's not quite as simple as saying it's a function of scale, but the very, very largest multinational insurers have typically been strong voices in the global climate project for a number of years now, and those that weren't are firmly there now. But that's like the top 20 insurers in the world. The minute you start getting down into companies that maybe are sort of just large nationals or very sort of specialist niche insurers, then there's been quite a debate about the extent to which you put sustainability at the heart of their strategies or not. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of activity going on in companies of all size, but whether or not they want to sort of shout it from their rooftop or not is a point of some debate. What we've seen in the last 18 months, I think, is even for mid-size national insurers, that they're often putting sustainability at the heart of their strategy. There's a sense of enlightened self-interest in being part of the journey. What's the point in being a successful company if the world itself is no longer functioning, right? But at the very small end of the industry, there's still a debate to be had about whether or not this is just a case of having to comply with whatever rules are being enforced on a company by regulators or not. And we tend to work with the larger players, where there's a huge amount of effort in three dimensions. One is the responsible investment arena that Ariel mentioned, but also responsible underwriting, particularly for the property and casualty players, those insurers who are insuring and by extension enabling massive change infrastructure programs. That's a big decision. Oil and gas, coal, thermal coal being the obvious ones, but there's many other projects that are under debate as to whether insurers should be enabling those or not. And then along with that, there is the operational footprint. Any insurer is a corporate and does have an operational footprint of its own, and that's maybe 20% of its overall impact on the climate project, whereas responsible investment would be 40, 50%, and the choice of client and who you underwrite would be 30, 40% of the pie chart. So I don't know if those numbers sort of resonate with you, Ariel, but that's how we kind of see it in general across the market.
No, I think so. I think the operations piece is critical, but we certainly see from a materiality standpoint, there is a significant opportunity to impact on the investment space. And I don't even think just responsible investment, but just at the core of our investing approach. Life insurers, any type of insurer is by default a long-term investor. We have long-term liabilities, and therefore climate change and other sustainability issues are going to be impacting the companies we invest in, whether we like it or not. So starting today, rather than waiting for some of these challenges to be at our doorstep, is something that we've really thought about as a business.
Yeah, I've always found the insurance industry's part to play in climate change fascinating, just because it's really at the intersection of the transition risk and the regulatory policies, and then actually the physical risk itself in terms of what this is doing to some of the even some of the things that Ariel was talking about earlier around health or areas that aren't necessarily considered more of a natural disaster risk. Do you think that there's something unique that the insurance companies and the insurance industry is facing, just being in that sort of coalface of the risk management, both on the transition and on the physical risk side?
Maybe I'll go.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's unique, but I don't know if it's a unique position, but certainly the insurance industry's got a huge role to play in driving the change that this planet's going to go through in the next 50 years. And it's pleasing. I was at COP26, and one thing that really came through loud and clear is the extent to which the financial services industry is taking that baton and running with it, and the insurance industry within that has made a material commitment to driving that change. I think most of it, and this is a personal view, but most of enabling that change has to come through engagement with industries and corporates that have to transition from brown to green. I think there's only so much that the insurance industry can do to influence by choosing to exclude certain industries from its customer base.
Yeah, we have that question come up quite often, from our own investors and activists and, the global community at large, which is, what is the right choice to make? Is it divestment or engagement? And we've really taken an engagement approach. I think engagement can be challenging from an investing standpoint. If you're a fixed income investor versus an equity investor, there's some challenges there in engagement. But from an insurance standpoint, engagement is something that is just second nature. So something that we look at quite a bit. And I think, the industries where there is the greatest potential to have change are some of those industries that are targeted. And I would say, oil and gas, for example, some of the core competencies of that industry, such as, major operations, major projects, those are the same competencies that are going to help with things like carbon capture and storage. And while that's not, going to be the solution, just to, capture everything that we put out, I think that those nuances are something that we have to have conversations with in the business, because I think there is some perception that just walking away from those assets can be a good choice, but ultimately somebody else is going to come in who is less responsible and pick those up. So it's an ongoing discussion. I think there's lots of debates about what is the right approach.
Mm.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Just to change gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about the financial services and insurance sector, but one of the other big areas of sustainability that I want to dig into a bit is the issue of resource use. Obviously, there's going to be very significant changes in resource use in the oil and gas sector you've alluded to already, but also even in the last couple months with the move towards sanctions against Russia, we've seen very significant changes in materials costs and spikes in markets around the world in the physical economy, and this is creating risks that, again, may be something that we're going to be seeing more of as climate change becomes more acute. Just to bring Tracy back in, how do you look at the sort of the risk to these very physical assets, whether that's resource use, whether that's material moving towards moving away from non-renewable resources and towards more sustainable materials? Sort of, what does it look like from that angle?
So I'm kind of a glass half full guy. Unfortunately, I think in my business. So two things I want to capitalize on. First of all, is that there has been significant disruptions in supply chain resilience, whether it's Shanghai shutting down or the war in Ukraine. Those are just two extreme examples. There are lesser examples that permeate throughout the globe. And I think that they're becoming increasingly frequent for a couple of reasons. Number one, everybody has just-in-time delivery now. Nobody maintains inventory, which creates a stress on the supply chain as it exists and has existed for the last 50 years. But I will say that one of the things that this has done is reinforce the importance of the public-private partnership when we talk about sustainability. And I'll use the example of the electrical vehicle, right? So the challenge is more and more electric cars are being sold, but the infrastructure of countries has not kept up with this as it relates to charging stations, which has made that a less than viable solution for a large part of at least in the United States, because it is such a vast geographic region. The viability of using electrical vehicles for long trips has not been a reality, simply because the infrastructure that's required from a charging perspective is not in place yet. But what's happened is the result of the increase in gas prices has put more of an onus on that public-private partnership to develop solutions that will actually enable us to be more sustainable by using renewable fuels. What you're seeing is that there are more wind farms being developed off the coast. There are more alternative energy sources being leveraged, and the popularity and viability of them is going to do nothing but increase going forward. And you will find that in order for that to be sustainable, that partnership has to exist. The manufacturers of electric vehicles or electric technology partnering with infrastructure and governmental entities to ensure that legislation is passed that enables, it's not just about repairing roads, it's about putting together sustainable options for organizations as they move products globally. And I think if we do that right, then we will actually see an impact on the climate change issue in the world. I would say we're in the nascent stage of accepting climate change as a reality. And part of our responsibility as global citizens is to ensure that that alarm bell is rung, but rung professionally and responsibly, so that we're not just creating panic, we're creating viable alternatives that are agreeable to both the public and the private sector and actually have a pathway to success. It's not enough just to say you can't do this anymore. It's like the guy that brings you a problem but doesn't bring you a solution. You have to do both. You have to articulate a problem and then propose a solution. And that solution, I think, involves everybody from the public and the private sector working collaboratively to address these problems because they're not going to go away on their own. We as citizens of the world have to be responsible, and part of that is articulating the challenge and then actually being able to describe a viable solution that gives us an alternative path.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think Graham or Ariel, do you see the same sort of move towards a sort of whole of public and private sector approach in the financial services industry that Tracy's describing more in the real economy? If either one of you has anything to add on that front, I think it's a very interesting area that hopefully will proceed apace.
I think I agree. I think it's the big picture answer to your question around how we effectively diversify away from the reliance on certain resources today. I mean, if we take it to let's say sort of a corporate level, away from the sort of the environment that the corporates are operating within, I think there's a really interesting distinction between those corporates that do one thing and one thing really, really well, whether it's a particular product or a particular market, particular geography that they function in, and those corporates that have a natural diversity. A broad-based insurer, a broad-based asset manager has weathered every one of the shocks that have come so far. I go back to the top of this conversation, and Tracy alluded to the fact that not every organisation did survive the shocks that have come our way in the last 2 or 3 years. But within the global insurance marketplace, any diversified insurer did manage to get through it operationally, but also got through it from the point of view of the capital on the balance sheet, carried on serving its clients, honouring its liabilities, etc. Took some pretty big hits at times on the profit, but kept going and survived as a viable organisation. The companies that I saw go through the most stressful days and nights over the last couple of years were those companies that did one thing and one thing really well, because that one thing might well have been ultra exposed to the particular demands that dropped off overnight. And then if you sort of take that same concept of, are you diversified, are you not? Then you apply it to, some of these natural resources, and you say, well, okay, so if overnight we do find that we are, let's say, trying to wean ourselves off Russian fuel, for example. Well, there are certain economies we see who are finding it very, very hard to wean themselves off because they're over-reliant in other people's analysis rather than mine, over-reliance on that one fuel source. So I think that the general attitude that has to go on around a corporate table or around a public-private partnership dining table has to be around, right, how do we diversify our exposure as either a society or an organisation? And that to me is one of the big questions over the next 5 to 10 years, because we are undoubtedly going to go through dramatic changes, not just because of climate change, but the cost of living crisis, geopolitical shifts, and at times just the normal slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that come our way.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that is sort of where the world is headed. That we're not in as benign and stable times, and now we need to build up some more resilience for it. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I want to sort of bring on one last topic, which I sort of alluded to in the introduction, is that in some sectors of the economy, in some business boardrooms, there's still this idea that there's a trade-off between sustainability and profit margins or the bottom line. Obviously, I think everyone on this panel would agree to some extent that this is somewhat of a false choice, and that there's obviously ways to sort of get ahead of this, and actually because this is the way things are going, there's going to be that's not going to be sort of the trade-off in even 5 years' time. But I guess I'll start with Ariel. Sort of, how do you approach that sort of business leaders and partners and sort of other stakeholders who still do think in this dichotomy? Do you think that there are still a lot of people who are thinking this way? And how do we have that conversation about whether or not this is a false choice? I'm sure for some people it is, but for the ones who are just sort of thinking of this in a more reflexive way, how do we move past that mindset in a corporate setting?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's funny. I've been working in sustainability for a long time now. Since 2013 is when I kind of started in sustainability, and the conversations then were very different than the conversations today. Then it was, of a small group of people who you'd be talking to, maybe marketing, maybe you would get to talk to somebody from finance if you were lucky. Today, it's everybody at the level of both the executive groups and the board. Everybody wants to talk about it. Now, that doesn't mean that the conversation is always, to your point, this is what we should do because it is good for our business and it's good for people, and that's, there's a period at the end of that. I think most of the conversations that I've had now have shifted into, we know we need to do this, but there are just so many choices to make, and there are so many things to do. What are the right ones for our business? And I think that's where, having the conversation with people who maybe doubt that there is the link between sustainability and profitability, or sustainability and better business resilience, that's where those conversations need to come in. And I think, the folks who work in sustainability, of course, are coming in with a perspective that these are things that we have to do because they're the right thing. But at the end of the day, you need to have a conversation about the business imperative. And so usually when I'm speaking with leaders, it's for those who are not necessarily fully on board with implementing certain sustainability initiatives, it's asking the questions around why. What are they reading? What is the information that they're consuming? Because they usually have good reasons. And I think that's one thing that I think is critical, is that for the most part, most of the conversations that I've had with leaders who are not necessarily convinced of the value of sustainability, they have some really good arguments for it. And so it's actually talking about that in a fairly meaningful way. And when it comes to practical implementation of that, you're always going to have those leaders at the level of questioning every decision that you make, but in the practical implementation, you're also going to have champions. So it's kind of in terms of working and navigating that leadership space, it's listening first, and respecting that, there are some viewpoints that can be correct, but also, need to be contextualized around the broader societal movement towards sustainability. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of flavor. I've been in a lot of conversations, since I started my career about whether this is a value or not. And my strong belief is that it is, but the different ways in which to achieve that value are very different for different businesses.
So Matthew, I just want to add to what Ariel said, because I think she's hit a really important point. And that is, so we're a publicly traded company, right? So we have a responsibility quarterly to shareholders, which is important. And part of the dynamic between revenue versus sustainability is both an internal and external marketing campaign to talk about long-term sustained growth versus quarterly returns. And part of that is developing a good investor relations team that talks to your institutional investors about what the long-term capitalization could be if you do this the right way. So I think that and we're just barely starting that conversation globally, right? Because we have to unlearn some of the bad habits that we've had about what quarterly returns look like and how they impact the sustainability of the company. So part of that is developing a marketing strategy that focuses to the board, to the C-suite, about why sustainability is critically important for the organization for long-term growth. And at the same time, putting together a public-facing initiative that addresses the corporate responsibility of the organization while still maintaining a positive revenue picture. So I think those two things we're going to see more and more going forward. What that's going to mean is that there will be different types of investors that invest in your organization based on their understanding of the complexity of the world as it continues to evolve. And I think that the companies that can recognize that and then leverage that to actually position themselves to be a viable option going forward, we're going to see more and more of that manifest both in boardrooms, in corporate communications, and in marketing campaigns that not only just focus on the product, or they will then start to focus on the reputation and the brand that's developed as it relates to sustainability and revenue generation. So I think those two things you're going to see more and more kind of coincide. It's like the convergence between digital and physical security in my world, right? So the same thing we're going to see from the larger picture. Now watch, I'm probably 100% wrong, and if I am, sorry, but I really think that that's what the future looks like, and that's how we can help to influence what that looks like going forward.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of companies who are going to lose, there's an opportunity cost with not getting moving on this today, because the generations that are coming after, the Gen Z, those generations of workers and investors, millennials are set to inherit a substantial amount of wealth. They do care about these issues. And so I think that's, there's a strong opportunity cost with missing the boat on it. And, the way that you go about doing it is up to your business, but not getting on the boat is going to be a missed opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to bring Graham back in as well, I know he was saying just in the last segment about the difference between more diversified and non-diversified firms and how they think about continuity planning around sustainability. Do you see the same sort of breakdown in terms of this, of how more specialized versus diversified firms look at the so-called trade-off between sustainability and value, or is that or do you think it cuts in a somewhat different way?
Well, it's quite an interesting question, which plays to the point Tracy made that there are many different kinds of investor. But look, I mean, we work with private equity and venture capital firms, and there's no type of investor that is more driven by alpha, the bottom line, finding that extra buck, and they are taking the sustainability credentials of potential investments as seriously as anyone. Now, partly that's because they in turn will need to seek funding for the next fund that they want to set up, and therefore their own reputation matters. But it's also because they believe there is alpha to be made. There will always be people who see massive profits to be made by backing a vice. Whether that's a brown investment company or some other form of vice. But in reality, most people, and once you get to a certain scale, then you can't find these small chinks anyway. You need to find the norm, and the norm is now that if you don't have a sustainability story to tell, then it's going to be very hard to actually demonstrate a sustainable journey for your company, and no one will then fund it. No one will support the level of growth that you want to achieve as a management company. So I think we take all that together. I think there's genuine alpha to be made at times through doing the right thing. There's a massive downside opportunity cost, I think you said, Ariel, a massive downside to not being seen as being on the right side of history. And the opportunities to make substantial profits from backing badly behaved ventures, those opportunities are going to become tighter and tighter, and potentially will find themselves as isolated and untradable assets. It's common sense, I think, to try and do the right thing and make some money along the way.
Yeah, and I think realistically, firms engage in all sorts of behavior that's not directly tied to the balance sheet. There's all sorts of activity there. So I think sustainability sometimes gets that label, but there's lots of other activities that happen within a business that are hard to tie to alpha. But it's become accepted that those are relevant. So I think this is just a new one, and probably this conversation will be less vociferous 10 years, 15 years from now.
Yeah.
Can only hope, I suppose. Well, we're running towards the end of time, so I just want to do a quick summation before we close. I think this was a very interesting discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground, starting with the pandemic and some of the lessons that we've learned there in terms of the importance of technology, the importance of business agility, making new decisions, and thinking about things from a resilience mindset rather than just from a purely efficiency mindset. I like what Graham had to say about the best business continuity plans that you have aren't necessarily worth anything once the actual disaster strikes, even for something like a pandemic that was on so many people's mind. I think sort of looking at that from a sustainability lens, I think we've covered a lot of ground on sort of the physical risks, some of the stuff that Tracy's talked about monitoring and being able to sort of see where the next disaster is coming from and where your assets are located in that capacity, I think is invaluable. And I think looking at the sort of the services sector and some of the impact, particularly in the insurance markets, that have really been sort of at the intersection of all of this, has been really critical in understanding sort of how that sector is changing and how that is going to have its impacts on what gets funded, on where stakeholders are going across the global economy. And I think looking at some of the other big risks that are related to this, whether that's around the lockdown in China, whether it's around the war in Ukraine, and then looking at what that means for supply chains and resource use. I think that's very critical. And finally, I think that this discussion around how to make sure that this conversation continues to move forward, and we get beyond that false dichotomy of profit versus sustainability. I think everyone here seems very optimistic, and as am I, that we're definitely moving in the right direction as a business community, and hopefully we'll have a chance to continue to do that in the years ahead. So with that, I just want to thank our wonderful speakers, Tracy Reinhold, Ariel Kangashnami, and Graham Handy, for what has been a very fascinating and fantastic conversation. Also like to thank Everbridge once again for sponsoring the event and making it possible, and for all of you for listening. If you'd like to join similar events, please go to impact.economist.com for more information about what we have upcoming. Have a good evening and take care.